We have a quorum. I guess we should call the roll. And Gabi can see it, so you call it.
Okay, hold on. I can't see it yet. Participants. Okay. Louis, I'm just letting in people right now. Admit. Okay, so Eric Winkler.
Present.
You need to turn your.
Mine's off.
Teacher, get on to.
Okay.
Oh, Louis here.
Louis Hasbrook.
I'm here.
Okay. Carolyn Nish.
Here.
Marissa Elkins.
Here.
Deb Clemmer.
Here.
Angie Gregory.
Here.
Rachel Flynn-Kasuba.
Here.
Ben Weil.
Here.
All right, I believe I have everybody. Yes, and I'll let in the public. Okay, I think we're ready.
Okay. So I can't actually see the agenda.
I'll give you.
But I suspect that approving the minutes is
Yes.
the first one.
Yep.
So
Mhm.
do we have any opinions on approving? Oh, that's right. We do public comment period. So yes, we are now open for public comment period. I'm so good at this. Is there anyone from the public who would like to say anything? Let's see. Hands?
No.
Okay. Seeing none, we can move on to the approval of the minutes. Does anyone want to move to the minutes?
Move to approve.
Second?
Second.
Eric Winkler's second, Deb Clemmer moved, said it in the wrong order. Do we discuss? I've already forgotten the rules. No discussion. So we'll just call the roll and vote on it. You want to call it again?
Yep. Okay, Eric Winkler.
Approve.
Okay, Angie Gregory.
Approve.
Deb Clemmer.
Yes.
Louis Hasbrook.
Approved.
Okay. Rachel Flynn-Kasuba.
Approved.
Okay. Carolyn Nish.
Yes.
Marissa Elkins.
Yes.
And Ben Weil.
Yes.
Okay, I think I got everything.
Okay, and I think, is it the case that the next item is BEIC's?
I think it's actually Angie and then.
Oh, Angie, that's
Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
So the next item is an update on the pollinator committee from Angie.
Thanks, Ben. So yeah, we met on February 26th. We're going to be meeting again at the end of this month. I think it's also March 26th at 8 a.m. at the Roost. So join us if you would like to. Just to give a brief update of what we discussed, the club was all present and we reviewed some of the email correspondence between Tony Kusnieres, the school maintenance supervisor, and the student group. There's definitely support of a pollinator no-mow hill in general. There's discussion about city services not really being able to provide any type of continual maintenance. The city services was just going to plan to mow once a year just to reduce the woody brush. So the environmental club will really have to coordinate volunteers and a logistical plan for how to sustain the maintenance of that hill. And Richard Parcelliti was also present and able to speak on behalf of the DPW being able to support in some way logistically too at the beginning. So the team is going to also meet with Rose Cherneff from Gardening for the Future. There were some recommendations to get the soil tested. So I think the students are looking to do that once the ground thaws. And again, DPW can kind of support because they have some of the tools and implements to do so. And then we'll get that sent out. And then we had a discussion about the funding streams. It seems like, the club has a fund reserve around 2,500. There's also the student union grant cycle. They anticipate being able to get another few $100s, if not more from that. And then they will likely put forward a proposal from NESC, from the NESC fund for any gaps. And hopefully we can utilize some of the existing plant nursery relationships from DPW for the plant purchases. The club was about to meet with the NHS principal, so that's kind of the next step. They need to get that approval. And then hopefully they'll be working with Rose contract-wise, Rose Chernoff, to do the garden design and kind of inform the best practice for volunteer coordination. So they're aiming to do some planting in May. And there is definitely suggestion to really heavily chip the area to prevent drying out, and then they'll be reviewing any kind of drafts of designs with Tony, and so they're moving along. So it's been great. Yeah, I don't know if anybody has any questions, but that's the update.
It seems really exciting, and you've actually got it moving from a real standstill to something that's going to happen.
Yeah,
It's really exciting.
yeah, it's exciting for everyone.
Okay, so now we have Adam Sherman, it looks like maybe Nathan as well. So which one of you should be made a co-host in order to be able to present?
I already shared presenting capability.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Then, so I guess I'll just introduce VEIC was contracted by National Grid to provide us the service of designing a carbon reduction plan or a decarbonization plan for the city, which they're going to give to us. So we're going to use this in a bunch of ways. One, it provides us guidance. So hopefully once emergencies appear or once opportunities appear, we have a plan already in place that says you should probably at least be trying to be in concert with this general design. So that's one benefit. It's also a requirement for us to become a climate leader under DOER's Green Communities program, which from my perspective, the important thing is that it gives us access to an even bigger decarbonization grant. And so and this is the last step. We've accomplished all the other checkpoints. So VEIC is presenting to us this kind of interim phase of their study for comment from you all, and for us to think about how we want to use it, and if we have ideas that we want them to be thinking about for their final project. I hope I captured that well enough, Adam. So why don't you guys take it away?
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up, Ben. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you all and have the opportunity to present our work to date on this project and some of our preliminary findings. I'll just start with saying it's been an absolute pleasure to work with Ben and his team to gather all this information, delve into the details, and to culminate this project with a final master plan. As Ben mentioned, this is a project funded with support by National Grid. They have a new program underway where they are assisting communities across their service area in Massachusetts, as well as other entities, to do this type of master plan for decarbonization. So we have a lot of ground to cover and about 50 minutes of your time today. Our game plan for how to best use the time is to provide a quick introduction to who we are, like how this came to be. Some of that ground has already been covered. Give a little bit of context of what the scope of work and the boundaries of the analysis are, because there's a little nuance to that. Then take a look at the preliminary results on where you currently are today in your baseline of greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. That's been a focus of the work to date. And then discussion of some of the strategies that are under consideration for inclusion in the master plan, and to present and discuss the preliminary results. If folks are okay with it, I'd like to hold questions until the end, just because we do have a fair amount of ground to cover, and we can have a robust Q&A and open discussion at the end of the slide deck. So if that works for folks, we'll dive right in. So quick introduction to VEIC. We're the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. We're a 38-year-old mission-driven nonprofit. We are headquartered in Winooski, Vermont, but we have offices all over the country, and we operate several energy efficiency utilities, a third-party energy efficiency and sustainable energy utility. So this is really in our DNA to help organizations look at how to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, with energy being a major focus and a big chunk of the overall carbon emission footprint. So to quickly introduce our team on the call today, myself, Adam Sherman, I'm a managing consultant. I've been with the organization for 13 years. Also, Nathan Mascalino and Christine are on the call and will be co-presenting the slides today. Quickly to just note, there are a number of other key staff members who have been behind the scenes working on this, including Ben Foreman, Matt Delorier, and Abby Wiseman from our team. And I'll let Nathan and Christine introduce themselves when I'll hand off to them very shortly. So we'll do that then. So in terms of context of how this came to be and how we're proceeding, we really want to emphasize that when we were tasked to do this work by National Grid, we began by delving pretty deep into the existing work and the comprehensive plan from 2021 to look at where you are, looking at the goals and targets of where you hope to be, and then make sure that what we work on is really dovetailing and building upon your current great work and help you achieve these targets of your carbon neutral city operations by 2030, and then the net zero, community-wide target by 2050. So really, we're focused on just the municipal operations. Our scope of work has not included, the private residents and businesses based in the city of Northampton. To put a finer point on the kind of the boundary or scope of our work, it's important to note that there are a number of different categories. So this is a busy illustration from the Greenhouse GHG Protocol. They're an international organization that provide guidance to communities and organizations to do their greenhouse gas accounting. Our work is really focused on 2 out of the 3 major categories, which are the direct emissions from an entity, a community such as the city of Northampton, primarily from buildings. So what's excluded in this work is mobile sources from transportation and vehicles and snowplows and mobile equipment. We also did include all of the Scope 2 indirect emissions associated with the purchase of electricity. What's also excluded is what's commonly known as the Scope 3 emissions, which look at both the upstream sourcing of other resources and services, and then downstream products and services that are associated with a lot of organizations, but it's probably more applicable to like manufacturers who are purchasing goods, making a product, and then selling it to their customer base. So here I'll hand off to my colleague, Christine White, and please take it away, Christine.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. My name is Christine White. I am a lead analyst at VEIC. I focus primarily in this project on the data analysis piece and working on pulling together all of the data that you guys have provided or that the city has provided so that we can create the action plan. what we started out with was taking a look at the inventory of buildings and properties in the portfolio of Northampton and obtaining the utility bills and the utility information to form what we call the baseline, which is what we can then build off of in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this first graph shows the breakdown of the buildings and locations. And in our analysis portion, the wastewater treatment plant and water treatment are considered process loads and will be treated a little bit differently than the buildings portions. But what I'd like to highlight is that the education buildings also include multiple buildings in the vocational high school campus. So this is just a brief breakdown of all of that, all of those properties. Next slide, please. So in the inventory, the education buildings make up the greatest floor area of all the buildings. And then when you consider the emissions, it comes as no surprise that the education buildings contribute the greatest emissions because of that. But also the wastewater treatment plant and the water treatment processes are the next highest emissions. And then we have a couple of other categories of buildings with community and public safety taking up some good chunks of the emissions portion. Next, please. So for this, the total emissions, what we ended up calculating was around 5,290 metric tons of carbon per year. That's with scope 1 direct emissions, which are the fuel direct burning emissions. And those are approximately 60% of the total emissions. And then emissions from electricity comes out to be about 40% of the total. And you'll see over the last 4 years, there's been a slight decline in those direct emissions, and those are likely due to weather variations. When you have a wild winter, you have when you have a mild winter, you have lower heating demand. So, yeah. Next slide, please. We also took all of this information and looked at the buildings in a way of benchmarking across, looking at that and comparing with national averages. So we quantified, but now we want to see how Northampton's energy use compares against some national averages. And it turns out that the energy use intensity, which is the energy per square foot of space that you have for buildings, is on par with national averages. And, you know, that's great because you're located in the Northeast where you presumably would have a little bit higher energy use per square foot anyway, rather than in some of the more mild climates. Education and public safety are less efficient compared to averages for those categories. Offices are slightly more efficient than average, and community buildings are right on with average. And then the wastewater treatment plant, those are calculated, water treatment and wastewater treatment are calculated in a different way. Those are energy units per gallon of water or sewage per day. Next slide, please. So now we're going to start diving into some of the strategies for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and I will hand that over to my colleague, Nathan.
Thanks. Yeah. So Christine talked about baselining, where was Northampton when we started this process? What we did after benchmarking was go out and study a sampling of your buildings. This is a list of the properties that we visited over the summer. I guess not, it was more over the winter, late last year, early this year. We visited the top 11 energy users, and then we selected a handful of kind of more representative buildings. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about kind of like what we did when we were there and what we were looking for. So we visited, your, again, top 10 kind of like largest energy users, and then we got into a couple of buildings that were representative of what you have, for building stock. And we looked at specific measures for reducing and decarbonizing, and we've got kind of like three main categories here. The first one is, scope two purchase electricity on the left. We've got on-site fossil space heating fuels in the middle, which is where we really focused our attention because that kind of makes up the biggest portion of your carbon emissions. And then on-site fossil-based water heating. That's essentially for all potable water in all buildings. And, we looked at that as a separate category. We kind of, then like really arrived at some common themes and common measures that we saw kind of building after building with some of the same, same recommendations. One of those was certainly to kind of, in most applications, you really are in a good position to go away from fossil fuel based heated domestic hot water and move to a kind of a responsible electric heat pump scenario. I think some of that work started before we arrived, and I think it has continued, and that's great. What I would call like an excellent low hanging fruit project. Some of the strategies for fossil space heating, we put them on this list in no particular order. There's an opportunity in some buildings to kind of tighten up the shell, and then really utilizing some electrification based on heat pumps. We'll go to the next slide, Adam, and we'll talk about kind of really decarbonization strategies. So we took all of the data and all of the information and all of the surveys that we did in the 15 buildings that we visited. And we really have now kind of distilled that down into some decarbonization strategies. These are organized mostly from top to bottom in what I would call like kind of the most cost-effective manner, meaning that at the top of the list, you kind of you make a capital investment and you get a pretty good return, right? So there's a large amount of carbon offset per dollar. As we move down the list, it kind of comes more to, the cost effectiveness is not quite so great, so at the bottom of the list, we're looking at things that are kind of like really what you'd concentrate on getting to that last mile or, at the end when you're really close. And, we'll kind of go through some of these. The first one, we did that for all the buildings that we visited, which is essentially kind of going in, touring the building and coming up with a strategy and a survey to see, is this building a candidate for electrification? What are the really low hanging fruit projects? How can we kind of like integrate those into a plan? Conservation is a great measure for a municipality. And the example there is that if you've got buildings that are not highly utilized and you can move resources from that building into a different building and you can kind of either decommission or mothball buildings or sections of buildings, that's a really cost-effective way to reduce your kind of carbon influence. Energy efficiency measures, again, like you typically can get a pretty good bang for your buck. We really like to see control optimization, deploying ventilation, heat recovery is huge. That really showed up in a lot of your buildings. Fuel switching, I mentioned going from domestic hot water based on fuel to electric. And then, from there you get into like more capital improvements where you're removing large pieces of equipment and putting in new large pieces of equipment that utilize less fossil fuel or no fossil fuel to do the same work task. And at the bottom of the list, like I said, we really see kind of like that last mile. There's in many of your buildings, you're going to be able to be fuel free. In some, there's going to be some reliance on fuel for at least the foreseeable future. The options there are to, essentially work with a third party to acquire some RECs or some offsets. That kind of a little bit goes along with also putting in some kind of like site generation, which would be solar in most cases. We'll jump to the next slide.
I think just one thing I would add to kind of enrich the conversation is that this is a kind of widely industry standard best practices of, analogous to like waste management. You reduce, you reuse, then you recycle. That we have this kind of aspirational hierarchy, but in cases where we have a lot of time frame between like now and 2050, some of these can be really sequenced and phased over time following this order. In other cases, when we have a very short time frame, it's important to know that, some of these may be aspirational and you may have to, jump to the punchline a little bit faster. An example of that is item number 6, where it says, wait until the end of the lifespan of a heating system to replace it at that point in time. But if you have a 5-year window to meet a goal, a very aggressive goal, you would probably be skipping to step number 7 of early replacement and retirement of some of those large on-site emitters of your fossil heating systems. So I'll turn it back over to Nathan.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So, we're going to transition from, we talked about baseline, we talked about the visits that we made. We took all of the information from the buildings that we visited, and we're now applying all of that data on all of those discoveries across the entire building portfolio. And there's a lot of information on this slide, but we broke your buildings up into 3 main categories: small buildings, medium-sized buildings, and large buildings. And we broke those at, below 10,000 square feet, we've called that a small building. Up to 75,000 square feet, we've called that kind of like a medium-sized building, and anything over 75,000 square feet, we've classified as a large building. And in your case, almost in their entirety, the large buildings are all education buildings. So for each one of those building classifications, we have applied the technology that we would recommend and then calculated the offset and the savings based on that technology. So we'll go through the top building as an example. So buildings that are less than 10,000 square feet in your portfolio, that's mostly community and admin buildings. We've recommended that the fuel-based equipment in those buildings be replaced with air source heat pump equipment, and that the domestic hot water heating is transitioned from fuel to heat pump hot water heater. The HVAC associated heating, fuel combustion, will be offset in those buildings by 100%. The heat pump water heaters represent 10% of that 100%. There's some efficiency measures that we've also applied to that size building, which will account for a 5% kind of total energy savings. And that's the way that we've calculated the values for the entire portfolio. And I'm going to kick it back to Christine, and she's going to talk about the data, kind of that we've analyzed now that we've kind of put all of this information into that, call it that model.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Like Nathan said, all of those measures, they kind of came about based on what we saw in the buildings that we visited. And then we applied that across the entire portfolio based on those categorizations. And to understand the scope of this work in terms of project management, this graph is really showing the recommended retrofit measures and then the total number of buildings that they are recommended for. This also represents the total potential number of projects for consideration across the portfolio, although most of these will probably be bundled together into a single project. But it still requires a lot of equipment procurement and planning and coordination. So next slide, please. So once we applied that across the buildings, that next step is then to estimate the fuel savings. And what we found, we looked at both the fuel reduction measures and then the efficiency measures. And with the fuel reduction, we saw that as a total across the portfolio, we could reduce the fuel consumption by approximately 87% by electrifying those heating and hot water sources, and then using induction stoves in kitchens and other options. And there's still some fuel that's required for those really hard to electrify scenarios. And then for the electrification, with that, obviously, you're now going to increase your electricity usage. So in the efficient scenario, we see that there's only a 22% increase in electricity use. So it's not too bad there. Making up for that fossil usage is only 22% of electricity increase. So next slide, please. Then that is going to translate to avoided emissions. So we see approximately 60% of the emissions currently are from the fossil, and 40% are from electricity usage. And what we were able to do was reduce the emissions by 2,100 metric tons of carbon, so approximately 40% reduction, because we had to account for the increase in electricity usage. And so we're able to get down to that 40% reduction, and those are the avoided emissions there. And actually, I apologize, the title on this isn't correct, but one thing that's left out from this particular piece of the analysis that we haven't done just yet is taking into consideration the wastewater treatment plant and water treatment processes. Those are not yet accounted for here, and that's because the way that we're accounting for those is slightly different. So first, we were just looking at all of the buildings, what could be done within the building envelopes and the heating systems there. And for the next phase of this, we'll dive in a little deeper on wastewater treatment plant and the water treatment plant to hopefully realize some additional reductions there. But moving forward now, we need to think about, now that the buildings are electrified, what can Northampton do to try and reduce the electricity emissions? And I will hand over to Adam.
Thanks, Christine. So I think looking back to the previous slide, I guess I should go back to that slide and just look at there's still a significant amount of further reductions that are necessary to meet the net zero target. And so really this is a couple of options that can be deployed. More renewables. Solar PV is a big piece of that. There may be other renewables that could be done, and the potential for purchasing offsets. In general, we tend to recommend getting as far as you can with durable mitigation strategies of directly reducing your greenhouse gas emissions before purchasing an annual allotment to conceptually offset those. That's a annual operating expense that will drive up your costs without an associated return on investment like some of these other measures and opportunities provide. So looking forward, there is this conceptual question mark of, okay, you have a 2030 target, and as we electrify, we need to look at the regional greenhouse gas intensity of the grid supplied electricity that you're not only using, but now you're bumping up a little bit more electric use and being more dependent on that versus your fossil fuels. The good news is that NREL, this is a Cambium, it's a program of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Their long-term forecasts of the carbon intensity of grid electricity, and they have regional forecasts. This is data for the Massachusetts region. They're forecasting approximately a 30% decrease between now and 2030. So that would take a sizable chunk off the remaining greenhouse gas emissions in the slide that Christine just presented. I think what's interesting to look at is that by 2040, they're forecasting a 65% reduction in the carbon intensity of that grid supplied as more renewables come online and we rely less on fossil electricity generation. So that's very high level, highly speculative. I think the question that, we bring back to this committee is really how the remaining gap is closed and whether buying more time and pushing out a goal to 2040 or 2050 makes sense, or given the regulatory uncertainty and the climate at the national scale, whether that motivates the city of Northampton to double down and really push to reduce that electric carbon intensity of the electricity being procured. So I think that frames it in very high level. I feel like that's a good place for us to pause and for questions, like clarifying questions and concerns folks have, but also segue into a discussion of where we go from here and the process to finishing up this project for you.
Thanks, Adam. So I think we should just throw it open to questions and thoughts. Adam did ask a really big high level question that at some level is a legislator policy level thought issue. Go ahead, Eric.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to limit them. So the last slide you showed, I'm not suggesting that this is the pathway, but I'm curious. There's a do nothing component to this, is what you're saying, is that the grid is transforming and slowly decarbonizing. And the city of Northampton has nothing to do with that. That's just going to happen organically. So if we did nothing, not suggesting that we're going to do nothing, if we did nothing, where would our numbers be then? I mean, we're talking 30% of 40% of our emissions? Is that what the original number you talked about in terms of the distribution of carbon?
Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't run that analysis just yet. I would kind of characterize the choice as being not an either or, but how to optimize the and be proactive, chip away with more renewables within the city's portfolio, and have that on-site generation, but also be mindful that there are forecasts that the grid will naturally, outside of the city's control, get naturally greener, and you'll see that reduction on that front as well. So how this kind of culminates into what the final deliverable looks like, I will actually just skip ahead really quickly and show this is an actual illustration, so it's not specific to the city. We will be doing this analysis moving forward, but we can present this in two ways. One is a do nothing, business as usual trajectory between now and 2030 and show how much there would be a little bit of reduction based on that, the grid getting greener, and then quantify that difference of like what the city needs to proactively do yourselves. So we don't have those numbers right in front of us, but your question is exactly where the remaining work will go.
Yeah,
Can
so
I just do a follow-up?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and then I'll be quiet. Will your analysis provide cost per metric ton for each of the reduction recommendations? It sounded like you have a hierarchy that is a general trend of what is most cost effective and least cost effective, but from a fiscal standpoint, what kind of dollars are we talking about to achieve these goals, and how does that fit in with budgetary sort of constraints, and how we communicate the effectiveness of that? Because there is obviously, I'm sure you're not going to do this, but there's a cost benefit, right? There's some tangible value in doing this, which may or may not be directly reflected in terms of operational costs. They can be health benefits and societal benefits that are more difficult to quantify. But my question, will you include cost analysis as well?
Yes. So we'll look at this in two different ways. One, identify the capital cost, the investment costs of each of these measures, if there is one. And then also what the comparative operating costs are compared to continuing to burn the fossil fuel, and calculate a simple payback on those measures. But also, to your point, the other financial metric that we'll provide is a investment cost per metric ton of GHG emission mitigation. So you can look at the order of magnitude of some of these are really easy to deploy, and maybe, you know, a heat pump hot water heater is targeting 10% of your load. It's got a fairly good payback, but it's still only shaving, you know, 10% of a building's natural gas fossil fuel usage. So you'll be able to look at all these measures in a capital cost dollar per metric ton of mitigation benefit. So yes.
Can I ask a related question, which is the do nothing is never an option, right? Because all these properties degrade and things break, and you're always doing something. So are you intending to provide some sort of alternative scenario that allows you to essentially weigh the benefit of a planned investment that, say, electrifies against what would be an unplanned replacement or maintenance cost that is going to be an ongoing cost, so that you're really comparing apples to apples in these scenarios? So I'll give you the example of the high school has a pair of 400-ton chillers that are, no, it's 400 tons of chiller, 200 ton chillers, something like that. Anyway, two big chillers, two big R22 chillers. They don't work that great, and they could break anytime. If you were to replace them with some form of heat pump chiller, you're already replacing a chiller that is going to come, and you're going to have to replace it, and you get no benefit other than chilled water out of it. And to compare that against this replacement that's a heat pump chiller, so to help you kind of see that comparison.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and the answer is, generally speaking, that we look at the avoided cost of replacing the existing fossil fuel when it's kind of an end of life measure. When you do kind of this accelerated timeline and you're doing early retirement of a piece of equipment that has 15 years of usable life in it, it becomes a little bit trickier to put a very precise, avoided cost of what you would otherwise have to pay 10 years down the line to replace that, natural gas boiler. But yes, that is a consideration. I'll pause there and open it up for Christine and or Nathan to talk further about that.
Yeah, one thing that I do want to mention when you go through this electrification process, if you are, in many cases, you are able to keep your existing system as a backup for electrification. If the system that you're installing is sized slightly smaller and then you have a really cold day or something like that, you may want to have something in the background that could bump up that heat if you need to. And I think the way that we thought about that, the reason why there's still some percentage of remaining fuel usage is because many of these systems need to have some sort of redundancy to begin with. And as those phase out and they wear out, then you can start thinking about what's coming next for those redundant pieces. And so, ultimately, if you're going to be trying to replace something that's still in working order, I think that's typically what's recommended. And then as you are replacing things that are phased out, that are at the end of their lifetime, then you think of that in a slightly different way. So the costs are a little bit different for replacement of something that's still considered within its lifetime.
But Ben, to your point, I think that where we have a short list of these immediate, soon to be failing pieces of equipment, I think it's very reasonable to calculate the avoided cost. In general, my preference is to include the whole cost and then show how that calculation of avoided cost factors into it. And same thing with incentives and rebates and other mechanisms that can take a large CapEx number and chip away at it. But we would want to do that itemization so that you kind of have the full picture.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to go back to with Eric's question about, a do nothing scenario. I mean, the way that we typically treat a scenario like that is more of a business as usual rather than a do nothing. And the business as usual is essentially like for like replacement, and then, effects that are outside of your control, that are going to happen kind of as part of the economy or part of the whatever's forecasted for the electric grid. Those are just going to be placed in there as, assumptions going forward. So
I think we have Rachel and then Eric.
Thanks. Great presentation. Really helpful to see this information all laid out very clearly. So my question is on the business case. As you guys are putting that together, will the cost estimates be from averages based on your national work or regional work, or will they be specific labor and technology costs for this region in particular? And I'm thinking from that largely from the perspective of if we take this information, then drop it very specifically into capital planning and business cases, how much of a margin of error might we see once we go to actually, make those investments?
It's a wonderful question. I'll give a short answer and then open it up to the VIC team to put further context to it. So we try to, as much as possible, use data sources that are available specific to Massachusetts to make it, regionally specific. You do see national variations in HVAC costs, labor. Of all the analysis where there's the largest margin of error, even, if you were doing projects today, huge error bars on the capital cost for these systems. And so we will provide kind of order of magnitude capital cost estimates, but this will not provide the precision you need to like go to bond votes or do that type of due diligence. This will be a first look. And I think it's important to note that there will be large error bars on the kind of capital cost estimates.
And I think one thing that really helps with the capital cost information is helping to prioritize which ones you target immediately. And so, what we're going to be able to show with that order of magnitude is, what are you going to go ask for first, or what are you going to investigate trying to do as a project first? And so, yeah, I think that using that in a budgetary way is going to be a little more difficult.
Okay, so I think we have a question from Eric and then Angie.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I was not suggesting that we do nothing, that business as usual for the city would be to replace equipment with more efficient equipment. That would happen organically too. I was simply addressing what the grid's component is of the production of emissions, and if we did nothing, how would that change? So just want to be clear. That's not my intention to say we do nothing. Ben.
Hey, Angie.
And maybe this is more of a question for Christine, because I heard a decent amount about the scope 1 and reference to fossil fuels, but I also just wanted to get clarification. Is this decarbonization and our kind of inventory that's been collected also including our scope 1 emissions from chemicals and refrigerants, the things we need for our HVAC, our chiller, dining operations, and the pools that we have at the school?
In terms of like fugitive emissions, those are actually scope 3. So
No, not the fugitive. I don't mean that.
Sorry.
Because they're direct, and according to the greenhouse gas protocol, which it looks like you guys are following, they're direct scope 1.
Yeah, scope one fugitive emissions from refrigerants.
Oh, gotcha.
Are a scope one direct emission. However, they are a voluntary. It's a really important point, and I think that it's woefully overlooked in a lot of this. When we worked with the funder for this study, National Grid, we brought this issue up, and their priority was to not include it. Even though we did, I mean, just FYI, we did advocate for the inclusion of that because it's very important.
But isn't the city the client?
That's interesting.
Not when it's free?
Yeah.
To some degree, that's true, but that also, it doesn't, we can do two things. One, like if this is good enough to get us the climate leaders thing, I'm gonna take it, because it solves that one problem. But it's also a real problem that we ought to do internally to track our fugitive emissions and see what we can do about them. And we have the ability to do that. But I don't think we're doing it. So like to some degree to ask VEIC to do it would be, they'd just have to make a bunch of assumptions. Tell me if I'm wrong about that, but you wouldn't have any data from us that's useful.
I mean, you'd have to provide it, right?
We'd have to provide it, and we're not currently collecting it. So we'd have to go, basically, we've got an HVAC technician and we'd have Slava, how many pounds of our 410A have you bought this year? And, where'd it go?
Right. I just think for the storytelling, I was just kind of curious, and
Yeah.
I understand what the scope of this work is, and that's helpful. I don't know what percentage it would be. I'm assuming it'll probably be somewhere around 10% of the total city's emissions, maybe, but I have no idea. That it might be worth just at least knowing or having some.
Well, I
would
think
think.
it's important.
Yeah.
Because we do have the ability to track it.
Yeah.
We can track it internally. If we can track it, we can actually identify the culprits, and we can then do something, which is actually what matters.
Right. Like it could lead to
And
retirement.
so I would say, I'll take that as a suggestion from you that we actually implement that.
That'd be great if you want to, not to add more work.
We can definitely, and this is pretty standard in our final reports, acknowledge the fact that it wasn't in the scope, emphasize the importance of, and then also provide some context of, the standard refrigerants are 2,000 to 2,400 times more potent greenhouse gas emissions than CO2, and what industry-wide literature suggests as average annual leakage rates, and what typical units have X amount of charge in them, and what a catastrophic leak or discharge would account to in overall GHG emissions. So like it's outside the scope of work. We can't provide estimates and integrate that as a core component of the analysis, but as a short paragraph embedded in the final report and or slide deck, I think it's important enough for inclusion to build awareness around this issue.
Great. Thanks.
We also do have those recommendations within the building site visits in terms of, down the line, being sure that you pick natural refrigerant systems or systems with lower GWP. So those are already baked in to the recommendations.
Other thoughts, questions folks have?
Eric Winkler, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll do one more. At the beginning of the presentation, you talked about benchmarking baseline for the city against a national standard, and for me that's difficult to sort of get my head around, because there's huge weather differences across the nation. There's vintage. There's a grid infrastructure that is older or newer. So I'm curious about, do we have any better benchmarks about where Northampton is in terms of cities and towns in a similar climatic region using, a similar grid infrastructure. Just for comparison's sake, I don't think we should be compared to, Texas, for example, or California or states that have widely differing sort of genetics, if you will.
I'm happy I'm going to take a crack at it, but Christine can just speak to like the data sources a little bit more. But I think we almost didn't include that slide in our slide deck because we realize it's a little bit of a rabbit hole. When we're talking about you emit this much and now you're trying to shrink it, your energy use intensity, it's kind of a helpful metric to think about, like, are you using a lot, a little, but ultimately decarbonization is decarbonization. We included it for the primary reason of just giving you a sense of, like, if all your buildings are woefully energy hogs, jumping to slapping in a heat pump to displace that fossil fuel before tightening up a shell or doing these other things, it's a really important context to look at it. But I don't want to get distracted by kind of the whole nuance of the national average and whatnot. I think it's useful, but it can be a little bit of a rabbit hole. I'll leave it there and turn it over to Christine to talk about like the data sources and if there is something, geographically more relevant to Massachusetts.
Yeah, I mean, we use those numbers really just to get a sense of, like Adam said, what the efficiency, overall of your building is. And, really the ultimate goal here is benchmarking against yourself. And so your buildings use a certain amount per square foot, and then you want to reduce that over time. And so, the first thing that you're really going to be focusing on is that reduction in energy so that you don't need to replace equipment with as large of equipment as what you have now. If you can reduce what your buildings need in general, then, you can downsize your equipment and that saves on cost as well. And then from there, now you're going to employ that electrification scenario, and hopefully as you move forward, your buildings can become more efficient. So it's really mostly about, where is that biggest bang for your buck? And if you're kind of in that national average, probably within the Northeast, you're doing a little bit better than average, based on some of the older buildings that are up there. So, ultimately, though, the whole point of that benchmarking is really just to benchmark against yourself. And that was just for additional context.
So Eric, I'll just share with you that Mass Energy Insight is a database shared by basically most of the municipalities in the state, and it provides benchmarking against all the other ones in the state because it's their actual data and their actual square footages. And so you can not only see where we lie, but you get a histogram so you can kind of see how that data is skewed. In the end, like Christine said, you're still really benchmarking against yourself because you're trying to make decisions and take actions. But I can share with you kind of some screenshots of those graphs that help you see where we are for a bunch of those buildings.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, we have one question from Louis Hasbrook. Go ahead, Louis.
The grid distribution system for electricity, how is it compared to the increased demand, and will there be any problems with that? I know they're working to increase the capacity, but I don't know how much of an increase in electrical use we're looking at with this program.
Good question. I'm not sure I'm positioned to talk about the grid capacity there. We will work with National Grid, the funders, and we can come back to this committee with a better answer on that, and pull from other reports and resources that they've been working on. How much load growth capacity they have in Massachusetts in that area. So it's a good question. I don't have a direct answer, but we can include that in the final product, the final report. Well, I know we're at time. Just to quickly segue to the path forward, I just point to our overall scope of work and the timeline. We are now in March, and working to quickly wrap up the economic and greenhouse gas analysis and to prepare and deliver a final action plan in the next month and a half. That's our timeline to completion, and we're really very thankful for this opportunity to share our preliminary results so far, get the questions and feedback that we can then take and incorporate into the final product. And we'll be working in close coordination with Ben and his team as we do that. I would be also happy to provide our contact information if folks have follow-up questions or concerns. We will also distribute to Ben a copy of these slides that he can share with this group. And with
Thanks.
that, thank you all, and turn it back over to Ben and the team.
Thank
All
you.
right, thanks a lot, Adam and VIC team. Let's see, is the next one departments? Okay. Are any department representatives did have any news to share? Deb Clemmer.
Yeah, on Monday at Community Resources, people from POP, Pardon Our Progress, will be speaking and giving us updated details about what's going on and the layout for the next few years, the timeline, and there'll be a Q&A also, so worth checking it out. Oh, it's Monday, Community Resources from 5 to, is it 5? 5 o'clock till, it starts at 5, I believe, and it's remote and in person, hybrid,
That's great.
and it'll be here.
Carolyn, do you have anything?
It's percolating still, so no.
Louis?
I have some information about the new energy code, which came out just after our meeting last month, and then share a bit of the new building code, which has a provision for tiny houses, which is something that's new to the starting in January. I don't need to share the screen. I'm not that adept at it, but I have I could read some information. And I sent Gabby the 2 handouts I had, which she distributed. They're a little dry and a little lengthy, but it might be worth skimming them. So the latest version of the Massachusetts Stretch Energy Code was released in February on the 14th. There's a number of significant changes. Like I said, I sent around a draft version of the revised code redline to show the changes. Perhaps the most significant for existing residential buildings are changes to the HERS ratings requirements for major renovations and additions. The original stretch code required major renovations to meet HERS ratings between 52 and 58. The revised code allows HERS ratings for major renovations between 65 and 75. Essentially, this came about because people were not doing renovations because they couldn't make the code, couldn't meet code in any kind of a pragmatic way. And we did see quite a number of major renovations that cut back to minor renovations because of that. Another part of the code that had significant changes is section 405, the passive house building certification option. They expanded that to a great degree. And because it wasn't as concise as it needed to be. And they also actually added a pathway for occupancy for houses built to passive house standards that failed the testing. So that was quite interesting, I thought. The latest code changes include a section allowing energy efficiency credits for building materials that can demonstrate embodied carbon based on the actual material and the energy used to manufacture it. It's quite a complicated subject. I noted that it takes up 5 of the 21 pages of the residential code because, and I honestly haven't figured it out yet. The revised code doesn't include many changes to the municipal opt-in stretch energy code. One change of note, though, is that the maximum PERS rating for accessory dwelling units has been increased by 10 points from 42 for normal new construction to 52 for all electric units. Any questions about the energy code piece? Angie?
I just have, yeah. Sorry, I went back to my default mode of unmuting myself on Zoom. So with the opt-in or with the new stretch energy code, when there is a major renovation, is it then triggering the whole house has to meet that performance or just the addition?
If it's a major renovation, it involves the whole house and it requires that the whole house
I see.
be brought up. Additions are additions in and of themselves need to meet increased need to meet HERS rating numbers, and depending on the size of the addition covers whether the existing house that's being added to needs to also come up to standards. Oh, and I forgot that the commercial energy code had very minor changes to it. I don't think there's anything worth dealing with. It seems that it was more of a lot of the changes came about because of confusion about how to implement the residential energy code as written. And I think they made it simpler. So the other part is that the 10th edition of the residential building code includes an interesting approach, which is Appendix AQ, tiny houses. There are significant allowances for a tiny house is a building under 400 square feet of floor area. A significant number of changes like a single means of egress, slightly lower ceiling heights, sleeping lofts, which are not counted as floor areas, and ladders or modified stairs to access the loft. They must be constructed on a permanent foundation and meet other code requirements. They're also allowed a HERS rating 10 points higher than other new dwelling units based on their small size and inherent energy efficiency. As I said, I included a copy of that code. It doesn't cover what the rest of the whole building code does, but it does talk about it. And I have mixed feelings about it. The inclusion of a sleeping loft makes a 400 square foot house with a could be a 200 square foot sleeping loft practical to occupy, but a ladder or very steep stairs restricts access to younger children and older adults. And that's one of the reasons that the code has forced stairs to be easily navigable. And because people don't know who's going to live in the house after the original person gets there. So this is in some ways an exclusionary policy. You're going to build a dwelling unit that not everybody would be able to navigate. But on the other hand, the energy efficiency of inherent energy efficiency of a very small house is going to help, I think, across the board. And they also made a provision to build one of these tiny houses as an addition to an existing unit. So another way of potentially a accessory dwelling unit that's simpler to build and inherently energy efficient.
Go ahead, Eric.
questions?
Louis, to your point, I tried to read the whole thing before the meeting, but I couldn't, but it's very interesting and I appreciate that. But to your point there, I saw there was a minimum size for a loft of like 35 square feet. You're saying there's no
Right.
maximum size for the loft. So the whole 400 square foot tiny house could be a loft with 3 foot height ceiling, or I guess over three. So I can't remember what the height was, but the loft space didn't need to be the full like 6'8" or something like that. So
Right.
there's no
Yeah,
there's no maximum.
there isn't written one. I think the practical maximum is access. But I think that, and the loft is allowed to go down to a 0 height, so right to the eaves, but it's not considered occupied space below 3 feet.
Right.
I think it's just where you stuff all your extra stuff. It's a very interesting, came out of, sorry, came out of California, I think.
I think it's valuable to
but
have code that's specific to this, even if it's not perfect yet. Because as the preamble talks about, I mean, this is an option for housing that, people, we're starting to see. And I know there was a whole to do in Hadley with a tiny house that went in that didn't sound like they went through the proper channels to make it happen. But I think this is good. This is good stuff. It's a good start.
one thing that I've been looking at is the small dwelling units in SRO housing. And so there's lots of little single room occupancy dwelling units in affordable housing that have been built on about 300 odd square feet of area, completely functional. So, and believe it or not, it's possible to fit a whole bathroom with a 3-foot square shower on a 4x8 sheet of plywood, just barely making the clearances to the fixtures. The door would have to open out, of course.
No questions on that. I guess I can share a little bit of stuff. One is we got the recommendation from VEIC to go look at heat pump or look at water heaters everywhere and see where we could just replace them. That's what we did today. We got an engineering company, B2Q, out, and we went to pretty much every single building and tried to scope it out. And then they're going to present us with a proposal. Hopefully we can get some bulk pricing and get some good incentives and try to preempt water heater failures. We obviously missed one at Bridge Street School, but we're already taking some action on that. Rachel and Angie suggested that I offer a event on heat pumps, and so I am on March 26th at 1 p.m. at the Senior Center. I'm going to be talking about heat pumps, and there will be a variety of people there tabling from National Grid and from Abode, which is like a heat pump coach, and from some of our usual suspects who show up at this meeting who have put together their own kind of local heat pump coaching group. So we're doing that. Thanks for the idea. What am I missing? Oh, we talked to you guys about last time about East Hampton, West Hampton, Northampton Energy Advocate. We got that grant. We are going to be screening applicants. Is it next week? And so we should have that person hired pretty soon. Gabi and I are working with Community Action and Co-op Power on a partnership that will help low-income housing and or low-income people in whatever kind of housing, and particularly focusing on multifamily to kind of have easy-to-use packages of heat pumps, weatherization, and community solar. So we're working on that partnership. Oh, and then we also have, it's kind of all sort of related, the Electrify East Hampton, Northampton program funded by Mass CEC, Revise is the home performance contractor. That will also be starting. And so we're going to have another meeting at the Senior Center on May 6th to kind of roll out that, that'll be kind of our rollout event. I don't know. That's all I can think of right now.
Anybody else with any updates? I think we got everybody.
Should we move to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second,
Okay. I guess roll call. You want to do that?
Okay, so Eric Winkler.
Yes.
Okay, Louis Hasbro.
Yes.
Rich Parasolidi.
Yes.
Okay. Carolyn Mish.
Yes.
Melissa Elkins.
Yes.
Deb Clemmer.
yes.
Angie Gregory.
Yes.
Ben Weil.
Yes.
And Rachel Flynn Kasuba.
Yes.
All right. Great. Well, thank you,
Well done,
everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks.